You won't believe what the CEO offered the cleaning lady in a bold challenge? The room felt like a coin toss. Polished glass table, suits arranged like chess pieces, the afternoon sun sliding across the gleam of coffee cups and paper folders. Logan Griffin stood at the head, the kind of man who filled a room without anyone needing to shout his name. He tossed a stack of thin, foreign documents onto the table as if laying down a dare. "If anyone can tell me what these say, I'll give my month's salary." His voice carried the weight of a man who thought he had already bought the room's attention. The number came out easily, theatrically, $150,000. It was practiced braggadocio, a ripcord pulled for effect. Some executives chuckled. A few made perfunctory notes, masking the irritation that the public challenge inspired. It was a stunt, attention for the board, an ego play before the quarterly reports. Across the room, beneath the fluorescent glare by the supply closet, Rosie Monroe was finishing with a trash can and a dustpan. She had been in and out of Griffin Imports so long that she knew which copier jammed when it was frustrated, which receptionist liked lemon tea, and which executive never returned a stapler. She had no business in that meeting. Her mop bucket made a soft, steady rhythm behind the closed door. She paused when she heard the laughter. She paused again when Logan said the number. "I can translate it," she said. Nobody in that room expected the voice to be hers. It was not the voice of anyone noteworthy in a place that kept status on display. It was neither theatrical nor timid. It was matter-of-fact. The door to the boardroom creaked when the assistant, Mariana, had to step out for a discarded file, and she saw Rosie there, mop in hand, eye steady. A hush caught the air, as if someone had hit the brakes on the world. Logan arched an eyebrow and leaned forward. "You?" he said, letting incredulity dress up like interest. Rosie pulled the papers toward herself with one gloved hand. She read 2 lines, more to get the cadence than the content. Her face did not change. She translated a sentence into crisp English, and the boardroom, which had been settling into a comfortable boredom minutes earlier, tightened like a muscle. It reads as an inheritance notification. Missing heirs located. This entitles the named party to present claim within 90 days. There was the sound of money suddenly becoming real in a room that liked to treat money as concept rather than consequence. Logan's mouth thinned. His laugh from earlier had soured to something curious. The executives around him blinked, shuffled folders, glanced at one another, as if watching a coin land on a foreign table. Logan reached for one of the checks he kept for theatrical moments. He could have called it petty, but it was his way of making absurd promises into currency. He tore off a check for the declared sum and extended it across the table without the ceremony he used for donations to charities or press-friendly causes. Rosie looked at the check, then at Logan, then at the room full of faces that were suddenly drawn to her as if she were a circus act. She took the pen. Her handwriting was neat, no flourish, just a signature that said this was a transaction, not a spectacle. "I'll take it for the translation," she said, "and for my time." Logan tried a smile, the practiced smile of a man who assumed the world would find his gestures charming. "Consider it a finder's fee," he said. Rosie folded the check and placed it where her apron kept small necessities, gum, receipts she didn't want to lose, a note with a doctor's number. There was a pause, and then a softer, more deliberate voice in the room asked, "Would you consider more work? We're often in need." Rosie set boundaries with the same economy she used to sweep around the base of a long desk. "I'll take freelance interpretation," she said, "on my terms. No patronizing, no staged moments. I work for respect." The boardroom hummed with a different tempo after that, a moment of recalibration where the weight of a promise had moved from sport to contract. Logan, for reasons he himself didn't immediately understand, said yes. He leaned back and watched the woman who had been emptying bins 3 hours earlier. For the first time that day, he felt uncertain. After the immediate pile-on of astonished murmurs and hurried LinkedIn searches, Mariana walked Rosie to the elevator and, because some part of the office couldn't resist the human story unfolding beneath corporate glass, asked, "Do you have time for a quick starter kit? Paperwork, NDA, rates." Rosie said she had an hour, and then she didn't. She had a bus to catch and a son to pick up. She gave Mariana information on her terms, a phone number, a schedule that accommodated therapy sessions, and a stern note about dignity. "No press," she said. "I don't do press." The check in Rosie's hand was an odd weight. It would not erase months of late-night therapy copays. It would not make the childcare calls to the specialists any less expensive. But it felt, in a way, like a boundary completed. Logan thought he had given something grand. Rosie thought she had made a trade. Service for money. Terms for respect. The difference would matter later. If you're watching this, tell me, where are you tuning in from? She kept the early gigs small and professional. Meetings followed, and Rosie sat on the edge of conference tables as if she had always been meant to translate the foreign cadences executives pretended not to hear. There were short, precise moments that made more noise than any press release. She interpreted a Basque clause that had been italicized but misread, steering a potential supplier meeting from a lawsuit to a handshake. She whispered the meaning of a Catalan document into Logan's ear across a crowded table and watched as nods replaced frowns around the room. The montage of her competence was not flashy. No heroic music swelled. It was handed over contracts, relieved clients, and Logan's curiosity taking on a new shape. He found himself lingering in the doorway after meetings, asking small, careful questions. "Where did you learn Basque? You've worked at embassies? Do you ever want to leave this kind of work?" Rosie's answers were measured, the way she weighed a mop before she bought it. She had been an official translator once, a diplomatic interpreter who moved through rooms with quiet authority. That part of her history was not a story she told at cocktail parties. It was something she carried like a tool set in a satchel. She had left that life not because she loved the custodial work, she didn't, but because of consequences that had moved in on her like bad weather. Whistleblowing that emptied out opportunities, enemies who made sure doors closed. She did not tell Logan the full story in the fluorescent-lit meeting rooms. She only offered facts when needed. "I worked for government contracts," she said. "I interpret. I do not accept charity." Logan listened. He was not used to people who both refused pity and refused to be placid. It complicated the uncomplicated world he tended to inhabit. He liked challenges where the outcome was a scoreboard. Rosie didn't keep score. She offered precision and left the ego to other men who still needed it like oxygen. Home, however, was where the ledger balanced in ways numbers never could. Rosie's apartment was compact, a practical arrangement of books in multiple languages, a small map with pins where she'd lived or worked, and toys arranged by color because Noah liked patterns the way some people liked jazz. Noah was 7 and bright in the ways literature always loved to show brilliance, quick to notice small inconsistencies, attracted to repeating rhythms, a huge fan of trains and of the quiet of certain libraries. He was autistic, and that label came with benefits and burdens. There were therapy bills that arrived like small, insistent storms. There were programs and specialists and schedules that wouldn't bend for bad weather or for Logan's press. Noah's needs demanded structure, careful transitions, and people who could hold space for him when the world swelled. Rosie was a master of holding space. She planned their afternoons around therapy windows, added in sensory breaks that doubled as small pleasure rituals, a cup of cocoa, a short walk during golden hour, and kept an inbox of supportive notes from therapists who admired her dedication. She did not project pity onto Noah. She celebrated him. He had a laugh that could erase a brutal week, and a way of laying a small, imperfect train on an open notebook and declaring it a masterpiece. Logan learned bits of this slowly. He had asked Rosie once if she ever had support, and she had said, "No, not like you'd imagine. I have routines and a community. I have what I need." When he pressed, maybe because he wanted to know how vast the need was, or because he felt the tug of something better than curiosity, she told him that the costs for Noah's care were steady and that they required planning. She did not ask him for anything. The office rumor mill would later manufacture that story into a tidy rescue fantasy. The truth was less cinematic. Rosie managed, not with miracles, but with stubborn, steady arrangements. She counted what she needed, made calls, kept receipts. Small kindnesses from Logan followed, not enormous ones, but the kind that create a pattern. He had a doctor for his insomnia and a nanny who knew how to navigate the weekend soccer matches. He translated those privileges into offers, recommendations, introductions to a therapist who took delayed payments, a donation to a fund that helped with sensory tools. Rosie accepted none of it at first. When an envelope came with an unsolicited check from one of Logan's charity partners, the amount politely limited, the letter carefully non-committal, Rosie returned it with a note. "Respect, not charity," she wrote on a plain card. "If you'd like to help, hire me." Logan, reading the card in his office with blinds partially closed against a city he had built himself, felt something shift. He started to see Rosie not as a curiosity or a moral acquisition, but as someone who set terms. He admired that firmness. He was not immune to the warmness he felt when Noah, when given the chance, handed him a train and announced an invented schedule. It was a small bridge that made the world less corporate for Logan and less barren for Rosie. Then came an evening that was supposed to be ordinary, a thank you dinner that Logan threw for a group of clients and a couple of people from the supply chain office. Logan invited Rosie as a professional courtesy because she had been instrumental in a negotiation. He told himself it was simply right to include her, that it would keep the story neat and humble. Rosie accepted because she was asked in a way that proffered dignity, and because Noah was at his calming group with a sitter who knew the schedule. The restaurant was low-lit and had the kind of cloth napkins that made Logan feel he had orchestrated the evening. Conversation flowed from exchange rates to market strategies, and Rosie contributed with the same restraint she used in meetings, precise, economical, luminous when she chose to be. Logan listened mostly. At some point, the confidence he had been nursing throughout the evening, perhaps buoyed by wine he didn't usually drink, perhaps simply overwhelmed by an unfamiliar tenderness, compelled him. He leaned in and kissed her. It was the kind of move that felt like certainty to the man making it and like an assumption to the woman being kissed. Rosie pulled back immediately. It wasn't a theatrical recoil. It was a boundary resetting itself. "Logan," she said quietly, "I accepted professional work. I don't mix that with—" Her voice stopped, the unsaid trailing between them like an unfinished sentence. Logan felt more shame than he expected. For a man who had built empires, the loss of a moment could be a heavy commodity. He attempted to apologize with a half-joking attempt at levity that sounded hollow. Rosie's face was composed. She nodded, stood, and excused herself with the quiet efficiency of someone who cleaned up spills she did not cause. Rumors, like small, spiteful fires, need only a spark. The next day, the office rumor mill had already smoothed it into a version: the CEO, the cleaning lady, a stolen kiss. It mutated further in private corners of the company. Whispers about boundaries, whispers about influence, whispers about what a man's reputation might cost him. Phones lit up with texts to people who could be useful. Someone with an office in legal had a relative who worked in human resources. A secretary who liked to gossip had an enthusiastic follower in a board member's aide. James Morrison and Richard Hayes, two men who kept their cards close and their investments closer, met privately in Richard's glass-walled office. They were not loud, but the way their voices folded into the hotel of the building suggested little room for conscience. "She's dangerous," James said, which was shorthand for "her presence complicates what we planned." "What we planned," Richard echoed, because corporate planning was often planning for the future in the form of minimizing exposure. They had been content under Logan's unbothered leadership when he was efficient, when he produced results, and left messy decisions to committees. But now, affection had intruded. Affection in a leader is unpredictable. Affection in a leader who had the habit of making unilateral choices was the kind of risk both men recognized as a tax on their equilibrium. They convened others: Sandra Walsh, who oversaw HR and prided herself on the company line, a couple of silent board members who had the money and the time to care, Mariana, who found herself pulled into the gravity of something she had never wanted. The strategy they sketched was not criminally theatrical nor outrageously villainous. It was corporate. It was calculated. They would find a pretext to remove Rosie. They would cite performance, schedule incompatibility, even professionalism if necessary. They would make it administrative, bland, something that would not attract pity because pity was messy. When Logan learned of whispers, he bristled. He also, rather publicly, defended Rosie. He was not always graceful. He could be clumsy in his defense, his words thrown like life rafts, sometimes with sails missing. He had his ego tangled in the matter, yes, but he had something else too that affronted him more. The idea that someone he had come to respect, a person who demanded dignity on their own terms, would be swept aside by a board fearful of the optics of a man they perceived as compromised. He spoke at a meeting and said that Rosie had earned every contract she negotiated and that the company owed her professionalism. He used the words integrity and due process with the solemnity of someone reading from a script he'd only half believed before. His tone did not satisfy the board. Logan's defense, seen by some as grandstanding, by others as necessary leadership, pushed the board into panic. If he would not cooperate with the pressure play, the board realized the exposure could be worse. A leader who put his personal loyalty above the company's perceived risk was, by their lights, a liability. The response was surgical, a suspension presented as a temporary leave paid with the rhetoric of cooling off, a statement that framed the move as in the company's best interest. Logan's assistant was handed a letter that read like concern but functioned more like a lever. He was suspended pending an internal review. For Rosie, the suspension was one more reminder that power is sometimes protected by those most eager to preserve it. For Logan, it was a mirror, his image split into the man he had been and the man he might be. He attempted, in the ways he knew how, to fight it. Phone calls, private meetings, the kind of do-overs only money could purchase. But the board had learned that polish was sometimes more effective than grit, and in the immediate aftermath, Logan found himself sidelined. The company's PR team released a statement that sounded neutral and professional. The city that kept careful tabs on Griffin imports offered columns and cautious op-eds that praised governance, called for calm, and framed the story as one of corporate stewardship. The threads of rumor, which had once been a small fire, had become a public narrative that the board insisted must be managed. Rosie watched the news from the small table in her kitchen while Noah arranged his trains by color. She had thought the worst of her days would be the night she had to choose between therapy and groceries. She had not expected to be a pawn in a corporate chess game. She was not naive. She had been hardened by the years when her whistleblowing at Meridian Global had had consequences she still paid for in closed doors. She knew how small, proper careers could be flattened by bureaucracy and ambition. She called Mariana the day after Logan's suspension. "If they tried to make me a story," she said, "I will not be a charity headline." Mariana, always careful, tried to be helpful. "We can draft a statement that respects your privacy." Rosie declined with a single sentence. "No press. I did not trade my life for a headline." Her eyes lingered on Noah, who hummed to himself as he calibrated a bridge of blue and yellow cars. There were decisions to be made, bills to be reconciled. There were practical things that worried her more than optics. Meanwhile, the board made a list. They called for HR investigations. Anecdotal complaints that had never been filed properly were resurrected like some tedious species of graffiti. The plan was to create a paper trail, ordinary and bureaucratic, so that a termination, if it came, would read like protocol rather than vendetta. James and Richard exchanged glances of relief as each small administrative action was recorded. They felt safer each time a notation entered a file. Logan protested in a way he had never been asked to before. He tried to mobilize support among loyal executives, but loyalty is a complicated thing in a corporation. There were investors to consider and reputations to manage. His defenders were few and cautious. His detractors smelled advantage. The board wanted him in a place where they could control the narrative. They had the power to make his resistance look theatrical and self-indulgent. The suspension notice wore the color of civility. It was a velvet glove around an iron fist. Word leaked, as word always does. The media began to assemble the version they liked. Logan, the prodigal CEO, embroiled in controversy. Rosie, the woman who translated a sentence and reconfigured the company's optics. A kiss, a board sphere, a suspension. The story shaped itself into something tidy for readers who wanted easy morals. It was not tidy for the people living inside it. Rosie's phone rang with numbers she didn't recognize. Some were clumsy offers of support, others were query calls from reporters. She ignored most. She had David from the neighborhood legal aid number in her contacts, and she spent an hour on the phone arranging for counsel if the company took steps she could contest. She wanted to be ready. She did not want to be surprised the way she had been when Meridian Global had retaliated years earlier. That retaliation had been sharp and final. Job offers rescinded, reputations subtly undermined, doors closed with a polite click. What had happened then was still a bruise. She had kept a cardboard box with papers from that time, documents sealed in manila envelopes that looked like the detritus of an administrative life. She had preserved copies of emails that proved her whistleblowing correct, not out of spite, but because she knew evidence was a slow medicine that sometimes healed only in courtrooms. She had insisted on dignity then. She insisted on it now. Her archive was a small, private safeguard. Logan, unsure how to act without making things worse, tried to find the moral center. His suspension felt like a rebuke, but it also prompted clarity. He called his mother, an elegant woman who had managed the kind of households and reputations his family prized. She counseled him in the language of consequence. "You either show up for the people you believe in," she said, "or you align yourself with the ones who'd rather smooth the story and keep their hands clean." He showed up. He wrote, not in public, but in a note he left on Rosie's desk, a message that said nothing of compensation or influence. It said simply, "I value you. When this is over, for whatever it's worth, I'd like to explain the full truth. Not for you, for me." Rosie read it and folded it into the same apron drawer where she kept the check. It was not a salve. It was a small token of human decency she did not need to be negotiated. She did not know what he would do. She knew he had the capacity to both help and complicate. She was not willing to be used as a clean narrative for his redemption. That had been a tactic once, and her teeth still remembered it. Then the board made their next move. It was not dramatic. They had never liked drama for itself. They preferred the language of governance. An internal compliance review began, even as the rumor columns gleefully embroidered the edges of the story. The review would check schedules, examine billing practices in consultant contracts, assess whether someone with Rosie's patchwork of contracts fit the company's professional standards. It was a plausible pretense, and, in reality, the sort of thing that would either quietly pass or quietly end a career. Rosie packed the files she thought she might need. She had an envelope with the original check Logan had given her and copies of her diplomatic certifications. She tidied Noah's backpack with the same economy she used to fold linens in hotel rooms she'd once worked in during different seasons of her life. She met with David from Legal Aid, who told her that corporations often preferred these flames to go out quietly. That was how they protected themselves. "They're playing compliance," he said. "It's an old play. If you keep records and show the pattern, you have options." Options were not guarantees. Soap operas taught people the idea of a single dramatic court moment that cleared all wrongs. Real life was more patient. It required forms, persistence, quiet accumulation of evidence. There was a press conference in the lobby that week. Logan watched from the shadows as the company released a bland statement, insisting that they were committed to a fair review. Reporters had questions about the kiss, they had questions about the inheritance. They had found the narrative delicious and were not putting it down. Someone shoved a microphone forward and asked Logan's CEO ally, a man who had been promoted amid these corporate tempestuous days, whether the board had overreacted. "You can't play favorites," he said, "especially not at this level." Logan felt the words like a small pinprick. He wanted to shout that protection wasn't favoritism, it was basic human regard. But shouting didn't fix suspension notices stamped in polite legalese. At home, Noah often watched the news because he liked the rhythm of the anchors' voices. He lined trains across the living room, forming circuits that made sense and told stories in their tracks. Rosie made him pancakes that Sunday and smiled when he announced a timetable for the day. She did not tell him about suspensions or PR teams. There was a world worth building in the small act of serving syrup to a child who trusted the rhythm of pancakes. Logan's world had different rhythms, but similar fractures. He sat in his office and tried to plan. He considered making the suspension public in a different way to highlight the board's lack of transparency. He knew that would be a spectacle, a duel of reputations, and he was not a man who loved duels. He was a man who had always relied on leverage and control. With his leverage curtailed, he felt exposed in a way that frightened him. He had a sense, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that being right didn't automatically translate into power. In the parking lot that afternoon, a reporter approached him with a camera crew trailing like a nervous animal. "Any comment on the rumors?" she asked. "On Rosie Monroe? On your relationship?" Logan stared at the camera, at the lens that turned curiosity into commodity. "Rosie is a professional," he said, "and that's all I will say for now." There was a dignity to that, a restraint that had eluded him in the earlier stages. Some reporters took the silence as refusal, others filed it as nuance. The story kept rolling. Back in the office, there were memos, schedule inconsistency, consultant agreements, professional standards review. Each memo was a shovel, a neat piece of bureaucracy with edges that could cut. The board circulated the language of policy, and the policy moved like armor. Rosie felt the pressure and reacted as she always did, with preparation. She pulled the cardboard box from under the bed, the one with manila envelopes labeled in pen. She ran a scanner over the pages, emailed copies to David, and made an appointment with a lawyer willing to work on contingency. She stayed calm in a way that was not denial but practical stubbornness. She made lists, documents to obtain, witnesses to contact, dates to preserve. That evening, as she straightened Noah's train tracks, he crawled into her lap and asked an odd question, the kind only a child could ask with the clean certainty of someone who hadn't yet learned to carpet his language with worry. "Mama, is the man with the big buildings mad at you?" She considered how to explain the world to a child who saw the world as a sequence of trains and snacks and gentle hands. "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions we don't understand," she said. "But trains keep running and we keep building stations. We'll make sure our stations are safe." Noah hummed and returned to his trains. The matter, for him, was small.
The world, she thought, had a way of making small things large and large things unnecessarily dramatic. She would protect the small things first. Rumors metastasized. An anonymous social post with a blurry photo of Logan and Rosie at the restaurant found its way to a local blog. The blog turned the image into a narrative about impropriety. The board used the photo and, in a private compliance meeting, argued it was evidence of an entanglement that could compromise contracts with conservative clients. It was a slender argument dressed in risk management vocabulary, but it was enough for them. They wanted stability, and stability these days meant reducing chaos. Logan, cornered, reacted with a kind of instinct that had made him both a brilliant executive and a human commodity. He made choices that prioritized people. He called clients he trusted, he sent emails that were honest and short, and he refused to let the company paint the situation as something it wasn't. He refused, to a degree that cost him dearly, to let Rosie be sacrificed without protest. The protest landed him on a suspension notice that was as official as a stamp. It listed the company's need to protect corporate integrity during an ongoing review. It did not say whose integrity was being protected. It left the language intentionally foggy. Rosie felt a swell of indignation that hurt in a place she had learned to keep tender. It was not self-pity, it was a form of recognition that power sometimes needed to be faced like a person at the door with a clipboard. She did not want to be the kind of person who called down help and then accepted it as charity. She wanted to be the kind of person who could stand in the boardroom and show her materials and have people accept the truth. She had experience on both sides of public scrutiny. She had been the whistleblower at Meridian Global and felt the aftershock of a corporation's retaliation then. She had few illusions about how stars in suits could behave when their own positions were threatened. But this wasn't Meridian anymore. This was a company where she had turned an honest translation into a professional opportunity. It felt worse in some ways because the betrayal, if it was betrayal, was being carved by men who expected corporate governance to sanitize their choices. As the week thinned into weekend, Logan's suspension stood like a stanchion between him and the rest of the company. He was not the only one accused of misplaced priorities. He was merely visible. The board, having accomplished its tactical aim, felt safer. The rumor mill slowed, but the damage had been done. Contracts were delayed, internal emails folded into hollow ellipses, and the social climate of the office cooled. Rosie, in response, did something that surprised some and clarified her own compass. She tendered a letter of intent to take a leave of absence from the freelance contract. It was not resignation, it was a protective measure. When Logan, in a rare, unguarded moment, knocked at her door that week with an envelope and a face that looked smaller than she had ever seen, she didn't open it right away. He held out the envelope like an offering he didn't quite trust. Inside was a note and a plane ticket. Not for Paris, not yet. Just a ticket to a small-town conference on corporate ethics, professional travel, a way to step back. He was suspended, but he wanted to be involved in whatever came next. He wanted to show up for the person he had wronged, not with a check, but with attention. Rosie folded the ticket and tucked it into her apron pocket. "Thank you," she said, "but if you'll excuse me, I have a train to rearrange." He laughed then, an honest, human sound that reminded him of nights he hadn't lived in for a long time. She closed the door on that moment like closing a book at its chapter break. It was a pause that lasted longer than either anticipated. Word would come next from the board, and then another piece of paper, and perhaps a call from something colder than rumor, legal counsel with the kind of language that demanded answers and did not apologize for tone.
But for now, in that weekend's small domestic orbit, Rosie and Noah had pancakes, trains, and the steady ritual that kept them afloat. And above them, the corporate building that once seemed impenetrable hummed with men in suits who, for all their talk of governance, had only handled the human element like currency. They had underestimated one thing, that people like Rosie did not break easily because they had nothing to lose. They persisted because they had everything to preserve. On Monday, the company posted a carefully curated comment on social media. The board called for a period of reflection. The newsroom trimmed the story into a digestible column with a headline that read like a trivia fact. Logan's suspension had made the rounds. Rosie's name trended for a day, then dropped into the slow churn of internet forgetfulness. But some things do not live on the internet. They live in drawers, and in the patterns of child's play, and in the way a woman refuses to accept pity dressed as generosity. She cleaned that day like any other, but the mop was heavier with decision. She would stay if she could work on her terms, remotely if she must. She would leave if the company insisted on making her a cautionary tale. She kept her case files close and her phone closer. She had been punished once for speaking truth to power. She had not forgiven the world for that. She had prepared for it. Midday brought a meeting request that read simply, "Internal review, please attend." It was the type of request that could mean anything from simple clarification to the start of a formal disciplinary process. Rosie replied asking for the agenda, for names of attendees, and for the presence of HR counsel. They replied with boilerplate assurances that seemed designed to avoid specifics. Outside the building, a delivery truck idled. A man on a bike zipped by, carrying a stack of menus. Life continued to unfold in its ordinary way, as though corporate turbulence were a weather system that would soon clear. Inside, the boardroom prepared to reconvene, and the men who had called the plays adjusted their jackets and their vocabularies. They were, after all, professionals. The call came through from a number she didn't recognize that afternoon. "Ma'am," the voice said on the other end, "this is Agent Davis from the Federal Bureau of Investigation." She listened, the mop forgotten in her grip. Her hand held the phone with the mild tremor of someone who had learned long ago not to trust calm voices when they arrived at her door. The agent's words were careful. "We would like to ask you some questions about your previous employment with Meridian Global." Her mind tightened like the string on a violin. Meridian had been a place she had spoken against years earlier. She had been prepared for retaliation then, and she had suffered for it. She had not expected the past to return on the lighter schedule of the present, like a delayed train. The agent's question marked a pivot in the unfolding story. It suggested that the quiet, bureaucratic violence of a company trying to preserve its public image might have other tendrils reaching back into a past that had not been fully resolved. It suggested that a separate institution, one tasked with a different kind of accountability, was beginning to stir. She told Agent Davis she would be willing to speak, and then she hung up and sat on the floor between Noah's trains. The trains remained arranged in a perfect circle, and for a moment she allowed herself to imagine them stretching out into rails that could lead anywhere, including the kind of justice that bureaucracies only sometimes provided. The mop leaned against the counter like a soldier at rest. The check in the drawer felt less like currency and more like a promise kept and fulfilled. She felt the world tilt towards something uncertain. She did not fear the inquiry, she respected it. She had been careful to keep evidence, she had kept copies, and she had a small, private archive that might finally find a public. The phone felt like a small, urgent thing in Rosie's palm. Agent Davis spoke calmly, as if reading from a script meant to keep panic out of the lines. He asked her to come in, to bring anything she had from Meridian Global, the manila envelopes, the printouts, anything that tied words to dates. He mentioned a subpoena, the need for a formal statement, the possibility of protective measures for witnesses. Agent Chen would be there too, he said. Rosie folded herself into the rhythm she had learned: collect, preserve, move forward. She packed the cardboard box with measured hands. The envelopes felt heavier now that they were not only artifacts of an old fight, but potential threads that might stitch a larger truth. Noah watched her, curious but calm. She explained nothing more than she needed to. He asked only whether trains would still run if she had to go away, and she smiled and promised they would, and that she'd bring him back a small souvenir, perhaps a tiny metal train from a place she was going to visit for big people who make sure rules are fair. The FBI office smelled of coffee and paper, not the sensational things Rosie had imagined. Agent Davis and Agent Chen waited in a conference room lit with practical light. They treated her with professional, direct respect. They explained that this was not about settling a grudge. Federal corruption investigations moved slowly, carefully, often in circuits of subpoenas, sworn statements, and matched documents. They wanted her records because they believed Meridian's past dealings contained a pattern that matched other complaints. If they could consolidate evidence, emails, payment trails, internal memos, they could present a case robust enough to survive pre-trial motions. Rosie opened her box. The agents spread the contents like careful archivists. There were emails she had printed and stamped with dates she had copied into a log years earlier. There were contracts with redacted names she had kept because the pattern of redaction had seemed important at the time. And there were notes a colleague had handed her in a meeting before doors closed. None of it was dramatic on its face. Most of it looked like the dull refuse of bureaucracy. But for the agents, who knew how to read patterns beneath dullness, it was enough to begin. They asked her to tell the story in a recorded statement. She did so with the same controlled economy she used when she signed a check: facts first, inference last. She described what she had seen at Meridian, the emails that suggested improper payments to vendors, the contract terms that dissolved liabilities onto outsourced partners, and the moment she had taken her concerns to people who either ignored them or made them disappear. She handed them the precise notes she'd kept: no inventing, no dramatics, just evidence and context. There were weeks then that rearranged in the way of legal work. Agents Davis and Chen took depositions from former colleagues. Subpoenas were issued for servers, for archived emails, for accounting ledgers Meridian had hoped would remain inert in their corporate vaults. Rosie sat in small rooms beneath fluorescent lights, answering questions while a team of attorneys, federal and private, did their slow, exacting work. She was careful about what she said on the record, but she did not equivocate about dignity. She insisted on a simple condition: she would testify publicly if needed, but she would not be used for spectacle. She wanted not only to be heard, but to be respected. As the inquiry widened, the press began to sense that this was more than corporate gossip. The Meridian name showed up in quiet financial filings, in the kind of footnote that meant someone had found a loose end. When the first federal subpoenas to Meridian were announced, the boardrooms that had once laughed at the idea of a cleaner with a drawer of evidence felt something like cold air. Media outlets stopped treating the story as a parlor curiosity and started treating it as a matter to be followed. Griffin Imports, which had been wringing its hands about optics, felt the pressure differently now. Public scrutiny of Meridian meant scrutiny of everyone who had been touched by the company's practices. The board met behind closed doors and, for the first time in weeks, feared the consequences of a narrative they could not control. The suspension of Logan looked more like a liability when the narrative shifted from impropriety to possible retaliation against a whistleblower. Investors asked pointed questions. Clients canceled exploratory calls until they had clarity. The company's stock, which had not been falling precipitously, began to wobble on the news cycles. Rosie watched the scoreboard shift with none of the satisfaction that a spectator might feel. Vindication was not applause. It was a formal process that took patience and left scars. She continued to pick up Noah from therapy. She continued to fold laundry and make a plan for the week. In the quiet hours, she checked in with Agent Davis and occasionally with a federal prosecutor who wanted to brief her on evidentiary thresholds. The prosecutor, a woman with the kind of voice that suggested she had seen both the damage corruption did and the relief when it was wounded, told Rosie that if the evidence supported it, the government would seek a public remedy, subpoenas, civil suits, possibly criminal referrals for individuals whose actions met the statutory standards. She did not promise arrests. She promised process. The process included a small, crucial break: the landlord. When the agents tracked down a storage locker that had belonged to a former Meridian contractor, they found, tucked under a stack of dusty office stationery, a yellowed package that had been misfiled and forgotten. It contained meeting minutes and printed email chains that echoed what Rosie had preserved. There was nothing theatrical in the find, no smoking gun laid on a dais, but the cumulative effect of multiple archives matched to similar internal memos created the sort of pattern that federal prosecutors like to see. The documents suggested deliberate obfuscation, not accidents. That pattern, when made visible, compelled Meridian to change its tone. The company issued a terse statement acknowledging it was cooperating with a federal inquiry, which read like a window barely cracked open. Investors took comfort in the language of cooperation, but headlines had already spun a different narrative. This was not simply about one corporation making a mistake. This was about systems that allowed misconduct to persist. It is one thing to see your past vindicated on paper. It is another to stand in a courtroom while the nation watches. The day the grand jury convened, Rosie felt the natural human tremor of someone called to speak about years of resistance. She had rehearsed the facts, lined up the dates, and prepared to be precise. When the federal prosecutor told her what would likely happen in court, that documents, expert testimony, and perhaps the admission of carefully redacted audio would paint a picture, she nodded. Her job, she said simply, was to make sure the record was accurate. The courtroom itself was not the dramatic stage people imagined. It smelled like old wood and hand lotion. Cameras were barred from the room for certain hearings, but the world outside had already made up its mind about what this scene would mean. When Rosie took the stand before a federal grand jury and later in open court, she spoke clearly. She described dates, memos, instances where she had tried to raise concerns, and the responses that followed. She did not perform, she clarified. Her voice, when it wavered, did so only in the places where a human being acknowledging pain was unavoidable. She testified about Meridian's obfuscations not to exact revenge, but so that patterns could be seen and addressed. In the weeks that followed, Meridian's board released a statement that walked the narrow line between contrition and legal caution. They expressed regret for any past oversights and announced internal reforms. Part of the company's resolution was a settlement agreement with several plaintiffs that included financial compensation and a public acknowledgement that the company had not always met its own standards. The settlement was called pragmatic by analysts. The victims called it vindication. Rosie declined to describe the settlement in public detail, citing confidentiality clauses, but she allowed that the acknowledgement mattered more than the negotiation. For her, the writing of the record was not currency but clarity. In the wake of the settlement, attention turned back to Griffin Imports. The board, seeing how quickly a narrative could shift under federal scrutiny, convened to reassess their earlier choices. Public sympathy, however brief, tends to favor those who look wronged by power. Logan's suspension had become untenable when the public perceived that the company had acted to remove a woman whose work had been validated by federal investigators. The optics were now reversed. The company appeared to have punished someone who had done honest work. There was a quiet, formal meeting where the board asked for a vote to reinstate Logan as CEO. It passed by a narrow margin, and Logan returned to his office with a tempered stride. He did not celebrate. The reinstatement felt like reclamation rather than triumph. For him, the test was not to resume power, but to earn trust back in a way that mattered. His first public act after reinstatement was not a press conference. He went to Rosie. He left a note, as he had done before, but this time it carried a different payload. An apology that was not performative, one that took responsibility for his earlier lapse and for underestimating the institutional forces that had moved against her. He asked for a meeting, not as an executive, but as a person who wanted to make things right in tangible ways. They met in a small conference room that Logan had cleared of cameras and his usual entourage. The light came through the glass in a plain way. He listened as she recounted the balance between truth and dignity. He did not offer him self-congratulatory platitudes. Instead, he said, "I want to do this on your terms." When he presented the offer, a senior role that would give Rosie the authority she had earned, along with a package that included a full-time salary, health care, and a fund for Noah's therapies, he did not place it as charity. He placed it as recognition. Rosie read the contract. It included clauses she insisted on: autonomy over her projects, a non-disparagement clause to protect her reputation, a guarantee of no staged PR events without her consent, and a provision for a workplace mentorship program she could lead. For Noah, there was a plan for guaranteed coverage for therapies up to an agreed level and flexibility for appointments. She negotiated, as she always had, precisely without theatrics. She insisted on language that prioritized dignity over optics. She accepted the position, but only after securing a commitment that Griffin Imports would fund a pilot mentorship and job placement program for women in precarious labor situations, a project she wanted to steward. It was important she not be seen as being lifted by the company. The program would be a structural change, not proof of personal benevolence. Logan's transformation was visible in small choices. He invited her to board meetings as an equal, he stopped making speeches on her behalf, and he used his influence to protect the autonomy she had negotiated. When the initial round of apologies came from colleagues who had previously conspired, it felt complicated. Some offered sincere apologies and asked to be part of the repair. Others kept their distance and let the public relations team craft bland apologies. Rosie accepted apologies when they were earnest and moved on when they were not. She refused the moral theater of mass atonement that sought only to wash reputations clean. Once the public machinery had been set in motion, legal vindication, reinstatement, a senior role, the private life of Rosie and Logan moved toward a quieter kind of reckoning. Their partnership, born of mutual respect and tempered by conflict, grew more intimate without losing its terms. There were small moments: Logan learning to respect Noah's sensory needs and asking how to help without imposing, Rosie watching Logan attempt to cook pancakes for Noah and almost starting a small kitchen fire, both of them laughing and forgiven for their domestic misadventures. They went to Paris, officially, for a conference on corporate responsibility that Logan had been scheduled to attend before the suspension. It was, on paper, professional travel. In practice, it was a pause from the noise, a chance to test what a partnership built on mutual respect might feel like, away from the fluorescent lights and the columns that wrote about them. Paris, with its weathered stone and narrow streets, felt like a place where language could be patient. They walked in a slow arc from business meetings to quiet dinners, alternately speaking about governance and trains, about program budgets, and the small rituals that made Noah's days gentle. On the third evening, Logan took Rosie to a terrace overlooking the Seine. The city was a muffled chorus below. He did not make a spectacle of the moment. He leaned in as a man who had learned that grand gestures were less important than consistent respect. "I've built things," he said. Buildings, markets, strategies, I've had my hands full. But what I haven't done, and what I'm trying to learn to do better, is to build alongside someone, to partner, not to possess. Will you marry me? Rosie considered the shape of the question with a practical mind and with a heart that had not been taught to ride complacent waves. She thought of Noah and of the life she'd made that was steady rather than spectacular. She thought of the mentorship program she wanted to see mapped out across cities, not as a headline, but as a pipeline. She thought of Logan's insistence on making amends in policies and funds, not just words. She said yes because it fit the terms she set for her own life: respect, autonomy, and partnership. They married in a small ceremony in the city where Rosie grew up, surrounded by people who had been faithful when celebrity sparked and when silence did not. The wedding was not a press release. 2 months later, the story ran, not as the end of a fairy tale, but as the beginning of a deliberate partnership. It was a life choice made by 2 adults who had negotiated terms and insisted on dignity. Noah walked Rosie down the aisle in a moment that felt like a small cosmic repair. The mentorship program she had insisted upon launched under the Griffin umbrella, with funding and with a governance structure Rosie insisted on leading. It focused on providing paid apprenticeships, interpreter certification programs, childcare support, and a legal aid fund for women who had faced retaliation after exposing wrongdoing. The program offered not charity, but employment pathways. Rosie designed the curriculum to honor existing skills, hospitality, language proficiency, caregiving, and to provide pathways into roles where those skills were valued and compensated fairly. The first cohort of women entered the program shy and hopeful. Rosie taught them how to translate professional documents, coached interviews, and held workshops on workplace rights. Logan attended sessions not as a figure to be worshipped, but as someone there to listen and to support with resources. He learned to step back and leave space for the people the program aimed to empower. He became a public voice for systemic accountability, advocating for policy changes in supply chain contracts that had traditionally externalized risk onto contract workers. Some former colleagues found their way back into community in earnest ways. Mariana, who had watched the story unfold from the edges of administrative duty, became the program's coordinator. She taught the women office practices and the politics of corporate navigation. James Morrison and Richard Hayes did not vanish from the story entirely. Some offered belated apologies, focused on policy reforms they supported. Not every relationship healed, and some wounds remained. Those Rosie treated with the same pragmatic gentleness she applied to other parts of her life. Noah grew in the steady orbit of a childhood buffered by new supports. The fund for therapy made pragmatic differences: fewer frantic calls about missed payments, more consistent sessions with a therapist who specialized in sensory processing. He continued to love trains, which his teachers had learned to use as organizing metaphors for schedules and transitions. As he matured, he became a quiet advocate in his own small way, handing out train timetables he made at program open houses and insisting on the correct placement of toy bridges during public events. He did not become a symbol, he became a son with a life well served. When the program opened its doors to its first larger cohort, Rosie stood at a podium not to be celebrated, but to instruct. She spoke about dignity as a structure, not an emotion. She spoke about how structural supports, childcare stipends, paid apprenticeship wages, clear paths to hiring could alter the narrative that had long painted vulnerable people as victims rather than professionals. Her words were plain but exact. At the end, people lined up to speak to her not out of adulation, but to ask for guidance. There were legal ripples still to come. Certain Meridian executives faced a further inquiry, and the federal prosecutor's ongoing work made occasional headlines. Rosie watched the headlines with the same professional detachment she had brought to translations. When there were hearings, she testified as required. That process took time, sometimes too much time, but in the interim, the program continued, and people shifted from precarity to employment. The city noticed the small changes.
The applause felt less like praise and more like the sound of competence recognized. The program's mentorship board decided to create a public archive of best practices so other companies could implement similar policies. Logan used his influence to seed funding for an online platform to scale the curriculum. Rosie insisted the curriculum be open-sourced because dignity, once purchased by one institution, should not be hoarded. In time, Griffin Imports introduced a formal policy named not after any person, but after a principle, the Dignity Clause. It required explicit labor protections in all vendor contracts, a whistleblower hotline with independent oversight, and a budget line earmarked for apprenticeship stipends. The clause was a small structural change with meaningful enforcement mechanisms. When the board voted to adopt it, Rosie was one of the people who shaped the language. Not everyone embraced the change. There were critics who said that corporations could not be trusted to police themselves, and there were skeptics who noted that one company's policy did not change the entire market. Rosie agreed with all of them. She never assumed reform was finished. She practiced vigilance. But she also, importantly, practiced the joy of a life that had not been defined by victimhood. On an ordinary Tuesday, years after the first check had sat in her apron, Rosie walked into Griffin Imports' new community training center to find a small exhibition of artifacts, a yellowed manila envelope with a tag that read Foundations, a child's watercolor painting of a train labeled Noah Station, and a plaque bearing the names of the first cohort who had graduated from the apprenticeship program. She ran her hand along the display as if tracing a map. Those objects were small records of a long, deliberate work. Logan appeared beside her and, without ceremony, took her hand. He had become a man who measured power by what it gave back and not by how it decorated his life. They did not need to stage a press photo. They did not want to perform redemption. They wanted to continue the work. The city breathed on in its ordinary ways. There were still boardrooms that feared exposure, still companies resistant to systemic obligations. There were still families like Rosie's who needed consistent support. The program could not fix everything, but it had unlatched possibilities. Women earning fair wages, a child with stable care, a corporate culture learning to value human dignity as policy rather than charity. Years after the first translation had stopped a room and after federal subpoenas had rattled cabinets, the story that stuck with people was not the audacity of a check or the spectacle of a kiss. It was the quiet insistence of a woman who kept records, who refused pity, who negotiated terms, who insisted on dignity, and, when given authority, built pathways for others. On a clear spring morning, as Rosie and Logan walked through a neighborhood park with Noah skipping ahead, a woman approached them shyly. She had been part of the program's earliest class. She told Rosie, with a voice that trembled only slightly, that she had been offered a permanent position with benefits at a firm that once would have dismissed her as part-time help. She said she could now plan for her child's education in a way she hadn't thought possible. Her thanks was not dramatic, it was practical gratitude. It landed like a small payment for work done in a community. Rosie smiled at her, and the woman returned to her child with a sense of a future that felt steadier than it had been. That was the measure of what had changed, not one spectacular rescue, but the slow rearrangement of systems so that people could make choices without sacrificing dignity. If you're watching this and this story moved you, consider telling us where you're tuning in from. It helps us know the places that matter most. If this story resonated, please rate the video and subscribe for more stories about people who insist on dignity and build structures to match.
Thank you for watching.